Everybody. Been writing a lot this week. This will be my third post of the week, and I decided why write when we can try to do a little bit of a video. And so, what I wanted to take some time to talk about today is the unemployment report, which was just released for December of 2020. One of the things that I think people talk about a lot with economic data is that you get these reports out every month, and sometimes the media will take it and they'll spin a story around it. And people, I think, oftentimes worry that that story is somehow slanted one way or the other. And as many bad things as there are associated with the internet, one of the nice things about it is that you can use the internet to really do your own research and look at these reports on your own. It's very easy. And so what I want to do is take a couple minutes to go ahead and just look at last month's unemployment report and think about what are some of the trends that I notice about it as it relates to inequality. Before I do that, I want to just define a couple of things really quickly. And to do that, I'm going to share a whiteboard with you. I'm going to write on the whiteboard, and what you're going to see is that I have the handwriting of a third grade child. And hopefully after viewing this, you won't completely lose respect for me and you'll keep watching. I wanted to find a couple of terms that are going to help us as we think about how should we look at this unemployment report. The first term I want to describe is the idea of a job seeker. What is a job seeker? A job seeker is someone who is looking for work in the past 4 weeks. They're able to work. So if someone came today and offered them a job, they're able to take it, but they're not working. So that's a job seeker. Another term that we want to define before we go and look at the report is the idea of the labor force. The labor force is people who are seeking a job, so job seekers, which we just defined, or people who are actually working. We don't need to define that, we know what that means, people who are actually working. The unemployment rate that's typically presented, if you watch the news or read the newspaper and they talk about the unemployment rate, there are a lot of different unemployment rates that people define, but the one that you'll typically see reported is just the number of job seekers divided by the labor force. So that's the unemployment rate. Whoops. As you can see, the handwriting, not great. But if you see an unemployment rate of, let's say, 5%, which is lower than it is today, but if it were 5%, that would mean that 5% of workers are looking for, 5% of people who want a job or have a job can't find a job. So that's what the unemployment rate means. The other number I want to talk about today is the labor force participation rate. And that number is going to be equal to the labor force divided by the civilians, so people who aren't in the armed forces, non-institutional, people who aren't in jail, like that, population. So if we say the labor force participation rate is 70%, that means 70% of all people who are civilians and who aren't in prison or in a mental hospital or somewhere else where they've been institutionalized, 70% of those people are either working or are looking for a job. And so these terms, the unemployment rate and the labor force participation rates, are the things that I want to kind of go to the unemployment report and look at. So let's do that now. I'm going to open up a browser window, go to Google, and I'll share that with you guys. Go to Google, we can just Google December 2020 employment situation from the BLS. So this, if you Google this, the first thing that'll come up is the employment situation summary. That's the title of the report that's released on the first Friday of every month that summarizes the unemployment rate. We can look at this and we'll see that, hey, this thing was released at 8:30 a.m. today, Friday, January 8th. And we could read a bunch of stuff that they tell you, but I don't like to read things. That's a lot of work. I prefer to look at data. And so we can scroll down to the bottom of the page here. At the bottom of the page, there are a whole lot of tables here. And I want to walk through tables A1 to A4. Table A1 is the employment status of the civilian population by sex and age. It's the most basic table. We can open that up and we're going to see an economic news release table here, and we can see some totals here. And what we can see for one thing is that the labor force participation rate right here, and we can see it. The fourth column here is December 2019. Remember, December 2019, none of us knew the term social distancing. None of us had ever worn a mask, probably. I'm out in public. And those were days that I think are hard to remember. But back then, the labor force participation rate was 63.3%. And the number may seem low, but remember, this is everybody over the age of 16. A lot of these people are retired. A lot of these people may be in school still. And so 63.3% was the number back then. And we can see today it's 61.5%. That's a drop of about 1.8 percentage points. So when you think about the employment situation, one thing you should always keep in mind is there are fewer people today who are working, but also fewer people today who are looking for work. And that's not going to show up in the unemployment number because the unemployment number only includes people who are looking for work. Look at the unemployment rate. We can see that in December 2019, it was 3.6%. We can see that there. And we can see that today it's 6.7%. It's up by about 3.1 percentage points. It's up by about 90% if you want to think about it that way. It's a big increase in the unemployment rate. And we didn't see much improvement between November and December, not surprising given that we've really, at this point, failed to control the virus, and now we're just pretty much waiting for a vaccine to come along and kind of and disseminate itself. And so, you know, there hasn't been much improvement really in October, November, and December. We saw a drop. So, you know, that's, you probably heard this number, 6.7%. It hasn't changed. But, you know, what I want to kind of think about is I want to start to talk about, well, what are some of the underlying trends here? One thing I said earlier was, you know, we all get frustrated if we feel like the media is spinning things. And one narrative I think that has come out of this is that women are leaving the labor force in droves, which intuitively makes a lot of sense. We know that a lot of schools are working remotely. We know that moms are more likely to be caregivers. I've talked about that on this blog before. And we expect, well, if moms are more likely to be caregivers, they're probably also more likely to be the in-home teacher, and maybe they're dropping out of the labor force because of that. If we go down, we can look at women who are 20 and over. We can see, is that happening or not? Let's look at their labor force participation rate. Remember, that's the important number here. Labor force participation, like looking for work or working. That's what we want to talk about. We get the participation rate here, this blue row. And the fourth line is, what was it way back in December 2019? It was 59.2%. And we can see that it has in fact dropped considerably from 59.2% to 57.2%. That may not seem like a lot, 2 percentage points, but we're talking about 120 million people. So that's the difference of 2.4 million people, basically. So 2.4 million women are out of the labor force, which is a big number. So that might seem like, well, the narrative kind of is playing out. Of course, if we go look at men, you know, we would look at their participation rate, and we see that way back in December 2019, it was 71.5%. Today it's 69.7%, a drop of about 1.8 percentage points. And so really that narrative that women are dropping out in droves, you know, is only really barely more so than men, about 0.2 percentage points. So women are about 0.2 percentage points more likely to have dropped out of the labor force than men. Again, we're talking about hundreds of millions of people. So that 0.2 percentage points might be a couple 100,000 workers. So it's not a trivial deal, but it also might be somewhat overblown to say women are exiting in droves relative to men. So that narrative to me is a little bit weak. I'd like to see a little more data supporting it. I do think that what's happening, and if you look at the research on the topic, I think this is absolutely true, is that women who are working are suffering more than men in terms of stress because they are doing this kind of dual job of working and being an in-home teacher. They're probably always doing that to some extent, but they're doing it more now than they were before, and that is stressful. And so I'm not saying women are not suffering because of this, but what I am saying is that idea that they're just leaving the labor force in droves, I don't think so far we see it relative to men. And that's one nice thing about going to the data is you can kind of work through this kind of thing for yourself. Let's back out here. That's the just overall picture. Let's look at it by race a little bit. That's something that we've been talking about in this blog, and I've pointed out repeatedly that Black people, and as we'll see in a second, Hispanic people as well have suffered disproportionately. So that's going to be table A2, where they show you all these numbers by race. If we look at, let's look at the overall white number here. That's going to be in this panel here. We can see the unemployment rate for white people was 5.9% a month ago, and it's 6% today, so not very much change, maybe a slight increase. For Black people, we see the unemployment rate went from, so if you're looking at Black or African American, we see the unemployment rate went from 10.3% to 9.9%, a drop, and certainly that seems encouraging, but maybe not quite so encouraging. If we look at the participation rate here, we see that there's actually been a drop in labor force participation from 60.2% to 59.8%. So what that suggests is some of that decrease in the unemployment rate is not because Black people are finding more jobs, but instead because Black people, some of them are leaving the labor force and deciding not to look for work anymore, perhaps because they're discouraged, perhaps because they have to take care of kids. We don't really know from this data, but something's going on there. And indeed, if we look at this employment to population ratio, which is kind of saying how many people are employed relative to how many people are out there, we see it actually dropped a little bit. We don't see that same drop in labor force participation for white people. We can go back up to the top here and look at that. We can see not really a drop for white people, if anything, a slight increase. And so the picture isn't quite as rosy as it seems. And if we go down, we can see what's driving this actually. Here are men 20 and over, Black men 20 and over. And we can see that for them, their participation rate has been relatively constant, which means that for Black women, it has actually dropped a lot from 60.4% to 59.5%. Whether that's a blip in the data or something bigger is certainly unclear from just this one picture, but it does suggest that to the extent that Black people are leaving the labor force, it does look like women are driving it. If you think about, Black women versus white women, Black women are much more likely to be single moms and therefore probably much more likely to be bearing some of these school costs on themselves. And I think, again, this is 1 month of data. It's unclear how much to make of it, but certainly it's something to keep in mind and to look at and to think about is how is this a trend that's going to continue? And if so, ultimately, what does it mean for Black women in particular? We can go back and look at, so I think, the result of that analysis probably is that there does seem to have been a decrease in unemployment for Black people generally. Black men, it seems like that may be just kind of a unambiguously good trend. For Black women, it's a little bit more complicated. And again, that's a nice thing about looking at some of the data yourself, is you can kind of look at these things and think about them. For Hispanic people, the news is more unambiguously bad. If we look at the unemployment rate for Hispanic or Latino people, the unemployment rate went from 8.4 to 9.3%. And we see that the participation rate dropped ever so slightly. So that's two kind of bad things. And I've said before that even relative to Black people, Hispanic people are especially likely to be in the kinds of occupations that have really been affected by our failure to control the pandemic, things like restaurants, things like hospitality. Those industries are disproportionately affected. They are probably doing a little bit better in the summer. When we saw the Hispanic unemployment rate really kind of start to drop the summer and the fall, but as the virus has kind of re-upticked, Hispanic people have been especially affected. We can see 10.5, 10.3, 8.8, 8.4, 9.3. So we see the slowing kind of reversal of that good trend that goes along with the slowing and the reversal of the downward trend of the virus and the new peak we're experiencing now. So again, we can look at that. And the last thing I'll point out is just by education. One thing I've written about a lot in the blog is that a lot of the changes that have happened in this country over the last 40 years have been worse for people with less education. Look at the unemployment rate for people with less than a high school diploma. We can see that it actually went up a little bit to 9.8% over the last month. We can see that for high school graduates, it's lower overall, and the trend is not nearly as bad. 7.8 has been flat. For those with some college, we can see that here, some college, 6.3 to 6.3, again, lower, not a bad trend. Those with a bachelor's degree or higher, much lower, and a good downward trend. And so we kind of see this inequality playing out where not only are less educated people kind of have higher unemployment, but also the trend in the last couple of months doesn't look as good. In fact, it's bad. And so hopefully, that was just a quick walk through some of the data that's available, that you can go look for yourself. You don't need to You don't need to go and listen to Facebook. You don't need to go listen to the news. You don't need to do any of that. You can just go look for yourself. And I think some of the trends that come out of that look are pretty interesting. So hopefully this has been interesting for you. If not, sorry. In any case, hope you all have a good weekend.